you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Administrator. Administrator Power, wanted to turn your attention to Tunisia, a small country in North Africa, but one that has had outsized attention and importance given the fact that it was one of the few relative democratic success stories coming out of the Arab Spring. I have a specific question and then a more general question. The specific one is this. The budget suggests preserving military aid for Tunisia, but also a pretty dramatic cut to economic aid and to aid to civil society groups. That's worrying because, as you know, this is a moment of real crisis in Tunisia. President Said has turned his back on democratic norms, has engaged in a pretty repressive and overwhelming crackdown on dissent. And this seems like a moment where it would be important for us to send a signal to civil society that we are going to increase our support for their work, not decrease it. And so I wondered if, just on the specific question of how we look at our aid budget, trying to help give some oxygen to those that are trying to fight back against this slide away from democracy in Tunisia, how this budget is going to do that, and why we envision a cut to civil society money for Tunisia.
Well, I think the 24 request is for 14.5 million, but that is a lower number in part, again, because so many of the avenues in which we were engaging the government, at least 2 years ago, have been foreclosed by the actions by the government. So I'd want to dig into whether or not your premise is right about actual cuts to civil society. I would certainly agree with you that even when governments are backsliding, that can become cause just to shift resources from what you might have wished to do with a judicial body or with a ministry, to make sure that accountability doesn't suffer as well, or at least doesn't suffer a shortage of resources. It's certainly suffering. The other thing I would note, Senator, is that for the first time, this administration is coming forward with a proposal for an opportunity fund for the Middle East and North Africa. I don't know if that caught your attention. I think it's a $90 million fund. And the idea there is to be more opportunistic. Again, we don't see right now the likelihood of a democratic opening or a reverse of the backsliding in Tunisia, but if that were to happen, to be in a position to draw from that fund to meet the moment, whether through support for civil society or for the government. But let me get back to you on the specifics of what the cut from the $22.5 million FY22 level to a $14.5 million request, sort of what the modalities of that would be.
Yeah, listen, I worry that, I think you're right, some of it is driven by a lack of avenue. You've got a Minister of Interior who, is working hand in hand with Said's crackdown. But I worry that this is kind of an excuse to not get thoughtful and creative about how to find avenues to support civil society, and look forward to hearing back. Here's my more general question. I have been a critic of continuing the level of aid to Said's government, and one of the answers I get back is China, right? That becomes the excuse as to why we should be heavily invested in repressive regimes all over North Africa and the Middle East, that if we're not there, China will be. I know you've talked a lot about China here today, but on this sort of specific question about what I think many people here are inviting, a human rights and democracy race to the bottom with China, in which just because they are willing to fund repressive regimes and economically backwards regimes, we should as well. And my sense is that the way that we compete with China successfully is to not be China, is to bring our values and our standards to these conversations, and to have a walkaway moment where the cost is just too high if a government is engaged in massive repression, or their economy is such a mess that it doesn't make sense for us to be involved in the long run. We haven't done that much, despite the president talking about putting human rights and democracy first. We still stay engaged with a lot of countries that have been moving the wrong way pretty fast. But not litigating that specific question of policy, what do you think about this idea that there's a risk of being engaged in a human rights democracy race to the bottom with China? There's got to be a point at which we walk away.
Well, let me just take that question, if I could, from my vantage point as administrator of USAID, where we have significantly increased our investments in democracy and human rights, where I very much agree with you that those investments, that support, including by voice, but also by programming, is a key distinguishing feature. The PRC does government to government this and that. PRC brings its own workers in to make substantial investments. The debt distress that so many countries are suffering comes about in part because they're so busy servicing debt and don't have an ability to invest those revenue in the livelihoods of their citizens, the lives of their citizens. Well, we are, under President Biden, very significantly expanding those investments in these distinguishing features. Our attention to marginalized people, our attention to indigenous communities, our attention to LGBTQI individuals who are being persecuted across sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and beyond. So, I actually think that governments are seeing across the board much more substantial investments, not only than the previous administration, which may not be unexpected, but even then the Obama administration. I mean, I think the years of underinvestment in those groups that are holding governments accountable, we are trying to make up for lost time. That 17 years of democratic backsliding occurred, without an effort to really buck, or halt the momentum that the autocrats and others were having. I will say, putting to one side the walk away aspect of your question, if I may, we're doing a lot of business with a lot of countries. I mean, there are places where there is democratic backsliding where we are dramatically expanding our civil society programming resources, but we are also urgently working with them to curb emissions at the same time. And so, for USAID, even in a place like Afghanistan, where the Taliban is doing, 1 week just something just more monstrous than the thing that was done before and more self-defeating from the standpoint of the economy of the country, even there, we're not walking away because we want to help citizens meet basic needs. We want to support girls through online learning if we can't reach them in the classroom like we were able to do a couple years ago. So, it is this question of walking away versus engaging and continuing to be in the scrum, to even in governments that are repressive, to find reformist elements who want to liberalize. Maybe they want to liberalize aspects of the economy and not yet liberalize independent, press freedom. But sometimes, history shows that you get a foothold in there, you open things up, the private sector comes in, and that can, create openings that might not have existed otherwise. So I think on a case-by-case basis, one can discuss, again, whether taking our marbles and going home is the right strategy. But I find that there's a real hunger right now for the American alternative, and that includes support for civil society, raising our voice for those who are being repressed, raising our voice for marginalized populations, and to lose that aspect of our foreign policy really would be to lose a comparative advantage.
Yeah, I don't know that I disagree with any of that. I think often the rationale for our continued economic and security assistance, and maybe I'm talking to the wrong person about security assistance, is often connected to our need to have a foothold inside these countries to compete with China. It's not always connected to our efforts to lift up democracy and human rights. And that's why Tunisia, for me, is an interesting example, a place where we've continued the same level of military assistance, despite the fact that the military is engaged in this crackdown, and we're cutting aid that arguably is channeled through to civil society. And my guess is the reason we've done that is to try to have some influence with the Tunisian regime because China's knocking at the door, and the way we get that influence is through economic aid and military aid that the government has a role in. That troubles me side by side with these reductions in support for civil society, but I will look forward to continuing the conversation. All right, man.